The 8th chapter of our text is entitled The Sustainer God. This is the 3rd chapter that we have focused on various aspects of God's love, and we see that in the Bible. God is everlasting love, loving kindness, love to Israel. He is a God of love. He shows love to the church. We're familiar with these, and again, as we've said before, that love characteristic is another one of those characteristics of God that cannot be seen, but He wants us to see it. So He puts physical illustrations of this characteristic into the creation. But He can demonstrate that in a variety of ways, and we've already looked at a couple of those ways. He shows His love in beneficial relationships. He shows His love in providing ahead of time for the needs of the creation. Now we're going to look at a third way in which God shows His love for the creation, and that is by sustaining it, by holding it together, and by providing for the needs as they come up. And we're going to see this in the biological world in the form of the biomatrix. The biomatrix is a term referring to the organisms in the world that have been put here largely unseen. We are unfamiliar, most of us are unfamiliar with the organisms of the biomatrix. They're the organisms that have to be there for plants and animals and us to live. We kind of have this feeling, I think, that we could exist without, we can't exist without plants, of course, to eat, but that we could exist on this planet with just plants and animals. Turns out that isn't the case. There is an unseen matrix. This is named after the film, which I guess for y'all is classic in the past and hardly know about, but the idea of the Matrix film was that the world that you see here is actually made of or constructed of a world of, in that case, numbers and digital and stuff that you just aren't aware of. And with that kind of concept, we realize the biological world is actually mostly made up of organisms that you cannot see. And the organisms that you can see are largely made up of organisms that you cannot see. There's an unseen world out there that turns out to be absolutely essential for organisms and for us to live. And they are the organisms that sustain us on this planet, that provide the needs for us, the nutrients we need. Animals require plants for food, but plants themselves couldn't survive if it wasn't for an unseen world of microorganisms that make it possible for plants to live on this planet. So God created what we call a biomatrix of unseen, unnoticed organisms that makes life possible for plants and ultimately for animals. They include the fungi. We see some of those from time to time, but there's a whole lot more that is invisible in the world of fungi than what can be seen. Also protozoans, one-celled organisms, most of which are impossible to be seen with the unaided eye. We need a microscope to see them. The algae, some of which again can be seen by the unaided eye, but most of which, a vast percentage of which, cannot be seen at all. And then the bacteria that are all too small to be seen. These are the organisms of the biomatrix. Really, the only organisms that aren't in the biomatrix are the plants and animals. Everything else is a biomatrix organism. What does the biomatrix do? What do the things composing the biomatrix do for us? First of all, the biomatrix functions as food providers. The organisms that do this are the algae, the photosynthetic bacteria, and some of the protozoa. Now, on the land, the animals need food, and the food producers for the animals are in fact the plants. So we often refer to the plants as producers. And on the land, the dominant producer for animals are in fact the plants. But what about in the water? What are the major producers of food in the water? There are a few plants that produce food in the water, but most of the food for animals of the water is produced by algae or by photosynthetic bacteria. Whereas the main producers on the land are plants, most of the producers in water environments are organisms of the biomatrix. Plants use photosynthesis to build their food. Algae uses photosynthesis to build its food. Photosynthesizing bacteria use photosynthesis to build their food. So among the purposes of the biomatrix is by the use of photosynthesis, food is produced for animals, especially the animals of the sea and the lakes and rivers. Now, whereas plants are all green for the most part and produce their food by what we call AB photosynthesis, the algae have a variety of ways to use photosynthesis to provide food. They use different pigments many times to collect different light colors, colors of light from the sun, in order to provide food for the animals of the water. So as a result, there are algae of different colors than green. There's green algae, but then there's also red algae, brown algae. We have these fancy names for these groups. Brown algae, red algae, blue-green algae, the yellow-green algae, and so on, golden algae. And they're called that because they have slightly different photosynthetic processes to produce food. They collect different light wavelengths to produce the food. In addition to the producers in water environments, producers in what we call extreme environments are all organisms of the biomatrix. Extreme environments are those places where, on the land, where plants can't live. For example, let's say salty environments. Plants don't do well at all in salty environments. There are a few plants that can handle that, but if you got a lot of salt, the producers in those environments are almost always organisms of the biomatrix. If things are too cold, if you've got ice, it's too cold for plants. But there are microorganisms of the biomatrix that can produce food in those circumstances. If you're in places that are too dark for plants, for example, in caves or at the bottom of the ocean or something like that, where you can't produce food by photosynthesis, or you're in a deep well where there's much too great a pressure for anything to exist that's kind of normal. Those are extreme environments. There are organisms of the biomatrix that produce food in those environments. In fact, the organisms of the biomatrix can produce food in just about every environment, every situation that we know of on this planet. Examples of producers in extreme environments would be the lichens. We've referred to them several times already. These are organisms that combine an alga and a fungus in such a way that they can live in places that normal plants can't live. They can live in places with too little water for plants to live. They can live in places that have no soil, and they can ultimately begin building the soil. They would be examples of organisms of the biomatrix because both the fungus and the alga are members of the biomatrix. But they do use, those particular biomatrix organisms use photosynthesis to produce their food. But in situations where photosynthesis isn't possible, such as dark places, places deep in the earth, or places at the bottom of the ocean, or places in muddy waters. If you can't use photosynthesis, these organisms actually have other ways of generating food, something called chemosynthesis. So rather than using light, photo, to get their energy, they get their energy from chemicals. So it's chemical synthesis, chemosynthesis, rather than photosynthesis. The organisms of the biomatrix produce food in any of those kind of environments. If it's too acid for plants, if it's too alkaline for plants, too hot for plants, like hot springs, if it's too cold, like in ice, Whatever those situations are, it's the biomatrix organisms that produce the food. But we also have some of the organisms of the biomatrix are consumers. They aren't producing the food, they are eating the food produced by the producers and function in that capacity. For example, let's say we're talking about the whales of the ocean. The whales of the ocean are eating small animals, but what are the small animals eating? Well, they're actually not usually eating the algae directly because the algae is too small. So there's something in between the producers, the algae, and the animals that are dependent upon that food. There's often a set of microorganisms called protozoa that are eating the food produced by the producers, and they themselves are eaten by the animals that then are eaten by the whales. And so in water environments, in addition to the fact that the biomatrix produces the food, very often the next step is the first level of consumers are actually biomatrix organisms also. In addition to providing food, the biomatrix organisms also break down molecules. And the organisms that do this are the fungi. They do a big job here. Many of the protozoa, some of the bacteria do this. This is really where the fungi excel. Examples of microorganisms that break down molecules would be the gut flora in animals. I referred to the fact that animals have these microorganisms in their intestines that help break down the food that the animals are ingesting so that the animals can get the food from it. Well, inside the intestine is not a pleasant place for most organisms to be. There are specially designed organisms of the biomatrix that live in the intestines of animals and help them digest food. In addition to the gut flora in animals, biomatrix organisms are also functioning as what we call decomposers in the world as a whole. When a branch falls off a tree, when an animal dies, when a tree dies, this material doesn't just accumulate and bury us in dead bodies. We find that very quickly this material disappears. And why does it disappear? Because there are organisms designed in the environment to break down those broken down branches and so on, so that they do not accumulate and do not drown us in dead bodies. The biomatrix organisms are the ones that do that decomposition. There are also, another function of the biomatrix is to convert molecules, to bring molecules from one form into another. Included in this is the process of fixation. We call this fixation. This is where an element, an atom that we really need, is usually stored in a form that we can't access. It's there, but we can't actually get it. For example, we need nitrogen. The atmosphere contains lots of nitrogen. We breathe nitrogen in, but we can't get the nitrogen out of the nitrogen. And we need iron. But chewing on iron doesn't get us the iron we need. The iron or the molybdenum or the calcium or the potassium, these things are things we need, but they're usually in a form that we cannot take it into our bodies and use it. So what God has done is He's designed special organisms that can take those elements and put them into a form that we can use. That process of taking an element from its unusable form into its form that we can use is called fixation. The organisms fix that element into a form that we can consume. Examples of this would be nitrogen-fixing bacteria. These are bacteria that are designed to take the nitrogen from the atmosphere that we can't get the nitrogen out of, break the bond between the nitrogen atoms, get the energy out of it, and in the process toss out stuff that turns out to be nitrates that plants can use to bring nitrates into the plants and then ultimately into us. Nitrogen-fixing bacteria are part of the biomatrix, providing nitrogen to all the organisms of the earth. Photosynthesis is another process. It's in plants and it's also in algae and so on, that fixes carbon. Carbon dioxide is in the atmosphere. We can breathe that stuff in, but we can't get the carbon out of the carbon dioxide. It's what all the molecules, pretty much all the molecules in our body are made of, yet we can't get the carbon out of carbon dioxide to build those molecules. Photosynthesis takes carbon dioxide and fixes it. Fixes the carbon from the carbon dioxide into organic molecules that we can then use to build our molecules. There are also a fascinating group, as we've learned more and more about this, we've encountered bacteria that fix other things that until just about 25, 30 years ago, we didn't know exists. We need, for example, a very small amount of molybdenum to build certain proteins in our body. But how do we get molybdenum? We can take molybdenum in rock, where it usually is found naturally, and we can chew on that rock and never get any molybdenum out of it. But we've discovered that there is a bacterium that actually produces a molecule that can mine molybdenum out of the rock. It's really cool. It produces this molecule that kind of looks like, if you have seen the videos of way back on the Apollo days when they landed on the moon with the object they called the Eagle. That thing that landed on the moon had a platform and a little bulbous place on top of it where the humans were in. It would land on the moon, and then when they got done, it would jettison this bulbous thing on top back into space, leaving the platform behind. That design is very similar to the design of the molecule produced by these, I'm going to call them mining bacteria. They produce a molecule that has legs on it. It lands on the rock, then it drills down into the rock, finds one atom of molybdenum, attaches to it. As soon as it attaches to it, it jettisons this bulbous thing on top of the platform, carrying the molybdenum atom with it. It's now combined in a molecule that can be used by that bacterium and all of us to create the proteins we need with the molybdenum in it. We're beginning to realize that all of the elements that we need are in fact somehow fixed by organisms, some organisms of the biomatrix. It's really cool stuff. There's also a need for defixing. Once a molecule has been used in organisms, once an element is no longer of use and is, let's say the organism's died or it's thrown out of the organism as waste, that element needs to be put back into its storage capacity, into wherever it was stored. For example, the carbon, once it's been used, needs to be put back into the atmosphere so that it can be used again. The molybdenum should be put back into the earth so that it can be used again by another organism. And there turns out to be organisms designed to take those waste products and return the element to its storage, its reservoir. So there's defixing organisms that reverse the direction of fixation. We have, for example, nitrogen defixing bacteria that put the nitrogen back into the atmosphere. We also have organisms in the biomatrix which are called remediators. These are really cool. These are some organisms that are designed to take molecules that are dangerous to life and make them undangerous. There's even organisms that are designed to take radioactive material that will kill or damage living things and make them undangerous. There's organisms that are designed to take garbage that might be poisonous and make them unpoisonous. It's really cool stuff. As the more we learn about this, the more we realize that there's an amazing array of organisms that can take even the poisons that we produce that aren't naturally generated in the world and figure out ways to make them undangerous. In addition, the biomatrix provides nutrients. Besides being able to break down things that are through decomposition, there are organisms that provide nutrients that otherwise you can't get. You can't get by eating plants and so on and so forth. For example, there are the organisms of the biomatrix that develop the soil. If you take a spoonful of soil and look at what is found inside, you'll find more than 10 to the 10th organisms of the biomatrix in that spoonful. 10 to the 10th would be, let's see, 100 billion organisms, microorganisms, in a single spoonful of soil. And these little guys, what are they doing in there? What they're doing is building the soil. They're putting nutrients into the soil. They're arranging the soil in such a way that plants can get the necessary nutrients out of the soil. We have mycorrhizal fungi, which I've referred to before. These are fungi that interact with the roots of plants, pulling in water and nutrients for the plant that the plant can't do itself. So the biomatrix helps the plants get their necessary nutrients. We also have vitamin producers. Vitamin B12 is an essential nutrient for us. It's needed in only very small amounts, but it's not made by any animal or plant, so you can't get it by eating plants or eating animals. What it is produced by organisms in the biomatrix so that we can have vitamin 12. Bacteria in our large intestine make vitamins K and H. H is also known as B7. These things are things we can't get from eating plants or animals. They're actually produced by microorganisms in our intestines. Pretty cool stuff. Biomatrix also provides protection. In the case of humans, for example, we have a skin that's specially designed to keep organisms out of our bodies that might do damage to us. And that's one of our first lines of protection against organisms that might do damage to us. But there's actually a line of protection before that, because on top of our skin, all over our body, is a whole flora of microorganisms. Bacteria are living on our skin that are supposed to be there. And if a bad guy lands on our skin, even though we can't see it, most of the time our skin flora, these bacteria that live and ought to live, are supposed to live on our skin, can outcompete and destroy the invading organism long before it can even penetrate the skin. So the organisms that live on the surface of our bodies actually contribute to protecting our bodies. The biomatrix is an amazing thing. We've only begun to understand what's going on in the biomatrix. We've learned that inside human bodies, inside the bodies of animals and plants, are millions upon millions upon millions of tiny little organisms that we cannot see. We haven't figured out why they're all there. We suspect that as we learn about them, we're going to find that they all have positive functions. They all have been designed by God to fulfill particular necessary functions for our survival, for the survival of animals and plants. The biomatrix, though unseen, is this amazing world that God has created to allow plants and animals to live on this earth.